Hello, everyone. I am thrilled to be here today with all of you in Athens for my first Athens Democracy Forum. I'm Patrick Healy. I'm the Deputy Opinion Editor of the New York Times, and I'm also formerly the Politics Editor of the Times, where I oversaw U.S. election coverage in 2018 and 2020. And in those jobs, I've been following for some time our guest today for the opening conversation of the forum. Stacey Abrams is one of the most influential and impactful American leaders in support of democracy and the democratic process. In politics, she was the Democratic leader in the Georgia House of Representatives, and she was her party's candidate for governor of Georgia in 2018. But for the purposes of today, I really want to focus on her work as the founder of two organizations. One was the New Georgia Project, which focuses on voter registration, and the other is Fair Fight, which is focused on promoting fair elections across the United States, educating voters about their rights, and fighting voter suppression tactics. Leader Abrams, welcome to the forum.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to see you. I want to go back, as the world saw in 2020, an American Democratic presidential candidate won the state of Georgia for the first time in 28 years. And then 2 months later, two Democratic Senate candidates won the Senate seats in Georgia. This was a historic moment in American political history, but also a critical moment for democracy. You saw voters in Georgia defy and reject the anti-democratic actions and messaging of President Donald Trump and his Republican allies. You were a pivotal player in this. Between 2018 and 2020, you, your organizations, your partners helped register more than 800,000 voters. And to remind everyone, Georgia had about 5 million people vote in 2020, and Joe Biden won by about 12,000 votes. So those 800,000 votes were critical. And I want to start by asking you about the state of democracy today. And specifically, is the democratic system showing resiliency in Georgia, in the US, around the world, or is it showing how vulnerable democracy is to bad faith actors and their allies in politics and in the media? How do you see that?
It's sadly and hopefully it's a both-and situation. When I began working on voting rights issues, I was a 17-year-old in college in 1991. And at the time, my mission was to expand participation in our democracy. The goal was to get my fellow college students and other young people to take advantage of the protected right to vote. Fast forward 20 plus years, and I have a very different mission. That is to protect the very franchise that I seek to expand, watching this undermining of it that began in earnest after the election of Barack Obama, but accelerated with the evisceration of the United States' Voting Rights Act. With the 2013 Shelby decision, we saw an aggressive weakening of the guardrails that protected the most vulnerable members of our society from voter suppression. But what we also saw happening on a parallel track was the continuation of a roughly 40-year diminution of this notion that we should all get to participate in democracy and should be able to rely on the government that we were voting for. And it's important that we think about these in parallel tracks, because the attack on democracy isn't simply an attack on the mechanics of casting a vote. It's also an attack on the utility of a democratically elected government versus an authoritarian government. And so to the extent we watch this evisceration that is happening both with the infrastructure of voting, but also this continued attack on the utility of the government itself, we are watching that resilience become undermined, and we are watching the forward march of authoritarianism under different guise, but with a similar end, which is the oppression of minority votes and voices, the solidification of power in a single ideological bloc, and sadly, the rejection of this notion that we are all in it together. And so, where I stand today is that while we watch 600 bills move through 48 states to undermine voting rights, we're also watching a national effort through the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act that again strike both a sense of hope but also a sense of despair that we are in this position in 2021.
Stacey, what does it say about the health of democracy that the majority party, the Democratic Party, in the White House, in the House, and in the Senate, which has control, is still not able, it seems, to stop that march, as you call it. And we see that in other countries as well. Even governing parties or governing coalitions still seem somehow unable to take the kind of action to support democracy.
The United States has a uniquely problematic system, and that is a U.S. Senate that is controlled through the process known as the filibuster. This is an antiquated mechanism that permits the minority party to block majority determinations by simply refusing to end debate. And it has been around for generations, but it had its most ignominious usage during the civil rights fights of the 1950s and 60s in the United States. And the challenge that we are seeing play out in melodramatic fashion with the president who holds the White House and has both the House and the Senate is that the ability of this mechanism to thwart democratic intentions, and small d democratic intentions, should be deeply disturbing to all of us. If we extrapolate out, we know that in other nations that have parliamentary systems, we are also watching sort of rump approach to governance, that the loudest but possibly weakest provisions prevail because they speak to some of the darker impulses in our society. In the United States, the pushback we are watching after Republicans in the present day is premised almost entirely on the changing racial demography of our nation. And this notion that the minority party does not believe they can return to political power if they have to adjust their ideological and policy approach to appeal. The challenge is then that we have members of our existing political space in the Democratic Party that so fear the consequences of a future bad act that they are unwilling to stop current bad actions. And my hope is that we're seeing progress being made. We have seen 50 Democrats vote twice now on both the Freedom to Vote Act and the People Act. I'm hopeful that the filibuster will start to weaken. I'm not absolutely certain that it will fall, but it is a commentary on our fear of one another that in order to preclude future evil, we are willing to be held hostage by current.
Stacey, why do you think so many democratic systems, not just in the U.S. but around the world, are either unprepared or vulnerable to deal with the strategies and the tactics of, as we were talking about, of bad faith actors, of their donors, of their allies in the news media? What is it? I mean, we could sort of talk about the Democratic Party in particular, but I'm curious, just since we have a global audience too, if you see sort of common themes among supporters of democracy. Maybe it's that supporters play too nice sometimes. I don't know, but what do you see as why there's that seemingly that vulnerability?
sadly, we have this halcyon vision of democracy. We remember the rise of democratic values and the quashing of authoritarian regimes that occurred post World War II. And there was a sense that there was a permanent wave of democratic values that were going to sweep our world, and that we were only watching successive growth of democratic institutions coming of age in our nations. And what we have witnessed in particularly the 20th century, the latter end of the 20th century and the 21st century, is that there is not the ability of democratic ethos that we thought to be true. We have watched very stable nations fall prey to authoritarianism because democracy is only seen as a vital and permanent solution as long as it is the one that provides the greatest amount of benefit to citizens. Mm-hmm. And there's certainly better scholars and theorists than myself who pointed out that competency has been the hallmark of whether or not democracy can withstand bad actors. But in every nation where we've seen authoritarianism gain traction and gain purchase, it is often because they are able to promise more stability, they are able to promise greater competency than a more fragile democratic system. And so if you use the United States as the current example, we are heading into what could likely be our third shutdown of our government since 2013. Prior to that, the last time the government shut down was 1995. And so part of the bad actor success has been that not only have they been able to promise greater competency, they've been able to leverage democracy against itself to show its weaknesses. I think around the world, what we have to acknowledge is our responsibility to ensure that not only are we espousing the benefits of democracy as a participatory process, but we've got to couple that with demonstrating that it is actually a functioning way to govern nations. Mm-hmm. And as long as authoritarianism, even with the quashing of individual rights, can show the functioning of government, we start to lose purchase in our argument. But it's a solvable problem if we are willing to acknowledge it and start to fix it. And I think the other piece of this is that the greatest weakness both in the United States and around the world, if you look at Hungary, if you look at the rise of authoritarianism in the Philippines, is that we are watching authoritarianism use democracy to gain purchase and to gain power. And that is the most dangerous piece. It is when democracy becomes the launching pad of its own demise that we should be most terrified. Because the most effective authoritarians leverage the premise of democracy to gain their platform, but then they start to dismantle all of the guardrails and protection that make democracy resilient, which is, going back to your original question, the great fear I have for the United States and for other nations that are on that cusp. If we look at what's happening in India and Brazil and what we have seen happen in Hungary, we are on this playing field where democracy is being bastardized to legitimate and to create pathways for authoritarianism.
And we definitely have been seeing that in America, where under the guise of what's called voter integrity or voter protection, you have these kind of phony audits of the vote going on by Republican leaders. One of my reporters after the 2020 election, when I asked him about whether President Trump was doing permanent damage to democracy in America, said that he thought so, in as much as that Trump has basically given a playbook to future politicians, and certainly you could see it in 2024, even if Trump himself runs, of basically of how to undermine faith and confidence in an election. And we certainly see these audits as just one step along those lines. I'm wondering, you touched on the voting rights bills that are in Congress right now. You've talked about your support for an exception to the filibuster for those. What does, in your view, President Biden need to act on this fall in order to make sure that democracy, that damage, is not permanent?
Let's begin with an understanding of what voter suppression and the erosion of democracy looks like in the United States. We have three prongs. One is the ability to register and to stay on the voting rolls, which in most democratized nations is an automatic right. In the United States and a few other democratic nations, you actually have to affirmatively ask to be included. And what's been weaponized is the registration and the ability to stay on the rolls. And that we've seen that happen in a number of states in the wake of the 2018 and 2020 elections, although a lot of this began, again, as I said, post the election of Obama in 2008. So it's, can you register and stay on the roll? The second question is, can you cast a ballot? And that is the actual act of being able to provide your vote. And that was impeded during COVID. It was impeded by the issues of absentee balloting and the risk of putting your life in danger if you go to a place to vote. And although we found very smart, innovative solutions, it's holding on to those solutions because the pandemic hasn't ended, but the pandemic revealed the inequities in our system. But it's also restrictive voter identification that limits how you can prove who you are. Not that you have to prove it, which is the misapplication is often given to the conversation about voter ID, but can you actually make that proof available? And unfortunately, we've watched a number of states restrict how you can prove who you are to privilege certain voters over others. And then the third is, does your vote get counted? So if you can run the gauntlet of getting your registered, staying on the rolls, casting your ballot, does your ballot actually count? And that goes to the subversion of democracy that we saw begin at the end of the 2020 election with the attempt to throw out votes. And we are watching accelerate through these bills that are moving through the states. I think we're now at 18 or 19 successful bills with 600 pending. And those bills seek to not only throw out votes if you vote in the wrong place with the right intent and with the right proof, if your vote arrives too late because the mail was slow, and now with the ability in a number of states for those responsible for certifying the election having the authority to throw the results out, or at the very least to undermine the election workers through intimidation and underfunding. So with all of that as the backdrop, the Freedom to Vote Act actually cuts through most of those challenges and says that no matter where you live in our country, you will have access to the same fundamental minimal standards of democracy. That does not exist today. And in a nation with 50 states, we have 50 different democratic experiments running. And this will, for the first time, really unify that part. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is the second bill, will say that going forward, any attempt to undermine this uniformity and this minimal standards would be subject to stronger evaluation through a process we call pre-clearance, saying that before you harm the right to vote for most Americans, you have to prove that your action is justified and valid and not driven by animus or discrimination.
Sure, but just to get back to, in terms of President Biden, what do you think he needs to do this fall? Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying. So I'm trying to lay the groundwork because I think it's important for this audience to understand what this does and why it's so critical for President Biden to the lead on this. What we have seen happen over the last 6 months has been quiet diplomacy amongst those who share these values. But it's important to understand the urgency to also get to why I think President Biden has been doing the right thing and how he's navigating this. Which is that if you have to have 50 votes from Democrats and you have to change the system, that cannot be done through bulldozing and through threat. It has to be done through negotiation and through recognition that we do have, for now, a democratic system of government. And I think what President Biden must continue to do is the diplomacy and the conversations that he's having with the leaders in our House and our Senate and make these laws real, but he's also doing the work of having the public conversation so people understand what's at risk. We lose when we pick one or the other. And just to tie it all together, when you reference my early work in 2020. The New Georgia project started in 2014, and my work started in 2010 because it took almost a decade to, in the state of Georgia, explain how this works. Imagine trying to change a national system for 300 million people. This is going to take time, but it also takes education. And I think that's the role of the commander-in-chief. The president's responsible for the educational piece, which is coming through the executive orders and speeches, but he's also responsible for compelling, through conversation and through relationship, action by the U.S. Senate.
I think that's a very important point that I kind of want to go back to, is the matter of time, because some of our participants and viewers may not be as familiar with Georgia or the way certain states work, and I think this is just so important to understand about America and the conversation, as you said it, not the bulldozing and the pushing, because that really often does not work in the democratic system, and unfortunately was really rejected, Trump's bulldozing in 2020, but it's that conversation. For so long, people have dreamed, Democrats dreamed of flipping Georgia and turning it blue. They now dream of doing so in Texas, for instance. And one of the keys to Georgia is what you were working on and what you were talking about, which is having the time, the years that was spent talking to voters, registering voters, not so much as many people think about persuading current voters to choose your party over their party. That's part of it, but it's about expanding and growing the vote, and that takes time, that takes years. When I talk to people about when it will come for Texas to turn blue, for a Democrat to become governor of Texas or to win a Senate seat for Texas, they often talk about the Stacey Abrams playbook, and that the playbook is so much about time and expanding the vote as opposed to trying to bulldoze, voters in one party to go to another party. And I want to ask you, in terms of that time that it takes, for a lot of countries, the situation for democracy is even more desperate than it is in America. What are some of the other ingredients, I guess, in addition to time, steps that can be taken to either sustain and renew democracy, or at least kind of fight the fights against what's chipping away at it?
Our most dangerous opponent in the sustaining of democracy is ignorance. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way, I mean in a very intentional way. So often we presume that those who are outside the system understand how the system works. And a great deal of the work that we did in Georgia was not just about expanding, but expanding through education, using real time and real life issues to galvanize and to uncover where the gaps in information are. And so often the urgency of trying to preserve democracy compels us to ally the work of actually building that base of invested voters. And that happens when they believe that there is a reason to vote. So the first job is voter education and connecting the dots. The second then is voter reality. I am very intentional about saying that voting is not magic. It is not going to transform society into this nirvana. Voting is medicine. And when we level set for voters that what we intend to create is not this perfect world, but a better world where your likelihood of getting what you need is expanded, then we are more likely to see people participate. And during COVID, we have seen that play out in a number of nations, as we've seen snap elections being called, not only the elections in the United States, but around the country, around the world. And so it's that level setting for voters so that they know what's actually feasible, and that the drop-off and disappointment post-election isn't so precipitous that they retreat and refuse to participate. And then the third is the repetition of 1 and 2. We can't presume that one conversation or one election is sufficient to create conversion. I talk about the 10-year plan because it took me 10 years to working with organizations and voters and with activists, but it took investment and platform and patience to keep going back. Because when any of those two pieces fall, when people don't trust the health or the system, that has an infective effect on the rest of their community. And so you may not have to start at the beginning, but you do have to go back. And so I would say those are the three pieces that are, I think, exportable to other states and other countries.
Stacey, as you look ahead, just at the landscape, and just to talk about, go sort of narrow to American elections. So when you look at 2022, how much risk are Democrats at right now, do you think, of losing control of the House and the Senate?
That depends very much on whether we have success with the Freedom to Vote Act. But for this reason, Democrats should not be guaranteed victory, but voters should be guaranteed access. And if we watch what voters did in 2018 and 2020, there is a deep hunger for representative democracy. And to the extent gerrymandering through the redistricting, the redrawing of political lines is hyper-partisan and does not have to pay attention to communities of color, then there's a very real risk that the new voters who have entered our process will lose their ability to elect leaders who reflect their values. By the same token, we also have to be very concerned about the ability to actually participate in the 22 elections. We have seen 18 states put in place voter suppression laws that will diminish participation if they're allowed to stand. And we don't know if there will be another fair or if there will be another slowdown in the process of processing votes. We don't know what is to come. And so unless we level set our democracy, no matter where we live, it's almost a guarantee that the voters who made choices in 18 and 20, that a significant number of them will be pushed out of the process. And that will not only affect Democratic versus Republican voters, it will affect partisan versus patriotic voters. We are not guaranteed victory, but every voter should be guaranteed access, and that should be the conversation and the deep worry.
And just a few last electoral questions. Do you think a Democrat will be elected governor of Texas in 2022?
I think it could happen.
And I know
Texas is in this space where we know it's possible, but we have to continue to do the work and we seek investment in growth. But I will tell you that it's clear that Republicans in Texas believe it's possible because they have been extraordinarily aggressive in restricting access to the right to vote in their state in fear of a competitive election.
And I know you're thinking a lot about ways to promote elections and voter education, certainly over the next 14 months going into the next election, and thinking about ways that the federal voting rights law can be passed. Are you also considering at this point running for governor of Georgia next year?
I appreciate the question, but I am solely focused on ensuring that we have democracy. And it sounds mildly hyperbolic, but we are heading into the dangerous territory of both the erosion of our democratic values and a redistricting session that will reshape politics for the next decade and for some for the next generation. And that's where my intention is going to continue.
And can I fit in one last one just on that? When do you think you'd make a decision about running for governor of Georgia?
As soon as I know what's happening with our democracy, I'll be able to shift my attention to other conversations.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Stacey Abrams, for joining us. It's been a real pleasure hearing you. Thanks very much.